The woman's body lay crumpled in the dirt like a discarded rag doll, her dress torn and dusty, one hand clutching her swollen belly. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the empty stretch of road between Fort Smith and Eureka Springs, Arkansas, in the summer of 1877. Preston Shaw had been riding for 3 days straight, trailing a herd of cattle he'd sold to a ranch 40 miles north, when he spotted the dark shape ahead on the rutted path. At first, he thought it might be a wounded animal, but as his horse drew closer, his breath caught in his throat. A woman. Pregnant. Alone. He dismounted quickly, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud as he rushed to her side. She was conscious but barely, her face pale beneath the coating of dust, lips cracked and bleeding. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and spread around her head like a halo. She couldn't have been more than 23, maybe 24 years old, and the swell of her belly suggested she was perhaps 7 or 8 months along. "Madam," he said, touching her shoulder gently. "Madam, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, revealing irises the color of moss after rain. She tried to speak, but only a weak rasp emerged from her throat. Preston looked around frantically. The road stretched empty in both directions, nothing but scrub brush and rocky terrain for miles. The nearest town was Eureka Springs, still a good 15 miles south. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and he knew from experience that these Arkansas hills could turn treacherous after dark. "I'm going to help you," he said firmly, making the decision in an instant. "You're going to be all right." He lifted her carefully, shocked by how light she was despite her condition. She must have been out here for hours, maybe longer, without food or water. Her dress was of decent quality, suggesting she hadn't always been destitute, but it was stained and torn now, particularly around the hem and sleeves. Preston carried her to the shade of a cluster of scrub oaks about 50 yards from the road. It wasn't much, but it was better than leaving her exposed to the brutal sun. He spread his bedroll on the ground and laid her down gently, then rushed back to his horse for his canteen. "Here," he said, supporting her head as he brought the water to her lips. "Slowly now, just small sips." She drank greedily at first, but he pulled the canteen away after a few swallows. "Not too much at once. It'll make you sick." Her eyes focused on him more clearly now, and he could see fear mixed with desperate gratitude in their depths. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse and brittle. "What's your name?" Preston asked, settling beside her. "Willow," she managed. "Willow Crawford." "I'm Preston Shaw. What happened to you, Miss Crawford? How did you end up out here?" Her eyes filled with tears that spilled down her dusty cheeks, leaving clean tracks through the grime. "My husband," she said, the words catching in her throat. "He left me here. Said he couldn't afford another mouth to feed, that I'd tricked him into the baby, that he never wanted to be a father." Preston's jaw tightened, anger flooding through him at the thought of any man abandoning a woman, especially one carrying his child. "How long ago?" "This morning, I think. Maybe yesterday. I'm not sure anymore. The sun kept moving and I tried to walk, but I couldn't. My feet gave out and I just couldn't get up again." Preston gave her another small drink, then dampened his bandana and wiped her face gently. "Well, you're not alone anymore. I'm going to take care of you." "You don't owe me anything," Willow said weakly. "You should go. I'll just slow you down." "I'm not leaving you," Preston said, and the certainty in his voice surprised even him. He'd been riding alone for years now, ever since his parents died of cholera when he was 19. He'd built a small ranch with his own 2 hands, working cattle and breaking horses, keeping to himself mostly. But something about this woman's situation struck deep into his chest, awakening a protective instinct he hadn't known he possessed. The sun continued its descent, and Preston knew he needed to prepare for the night. "I'm going to build a fire," he told Willow. Get some warmth going before it gets cold. These hills can drop 20 degrees after sunset." She nodded, already looking stronger now that she'd had water. Preston set about gathering dead wood and dried brush, building a proper fire ring with stones he collected from the surrounding area. He'd learned to be thorough with fires during his time working cattle drives, had seen what could happen when flames got out of control in dry conditions. As he worked, he kept glancing back at Willow, making sure she was still conscious, still breathing steadily. She watched him with those remarkable eyes, and he found himself wondering what her story really was beyond the bare facts she'd shared. What kind of life had she lived before this? What dreams had she cherished before they'd been shattered on this dusty road? The fire caught and grew, crackling cheerfully as darkness settled over the landscape. Preston unpacked his saddlebags, pulling out the provisions he'd been rationing for his journey home. Dried beef, hardtack, a small sack of cornmeal, coffee, and a precious jar of honey he'd traded for in Fort Smith. It wasn't much, but it would keep them alive. He heated water in his small pot and made a thin gruel with the cornmeal, sweetening it with honey. "You need to eat something," he said, helping Willow sit up. "Get your strength back." She ate slowly, and he could see each spoonful bringing life back into her body. Color returned to her cheeks, and her hands stopped trembling quite so badly. When she'd finished half the bowl, she pushed it back toward him. "You need to eat too," she said. Preston wanted to argue, but the concern in her voice stopped him. Even in her desperate state, she was thinking of him. He finished the rest of the gruel and made coffee, strong and bitter, which they shared while the fire popped and hissed. "Tell me about him," Preston said finally, keeping his voice gentle. "Your husband." Willow's hand went to her belly, a protective gesture that Preston was beginning to recognize. "His name was Richard Crawford. We met in Little Rock last year. I was working as a seamstress and he came into the shop where I worked. He was charming, said all the right things. Promised me a home, a future, children. I believed him." She paused, staring into the flames. "We married quickly, maybe too quickly. For a while it was good. He worked as a clerk in a shipping office. But then he started gambling, lost money we didn't have. When I told him I was pregnant, he was angry. Said I'd done it on purpose to trap him. We fought constantly. He lost his job, said it was my fault, that I distracted him. We left Little Rock 3 weeks ago, heading west. He said we'd start fresh in Indian territory, but I think he was just running from his debts. And this morning," Preston prompted, "this morning we were traveling this road. He stopped the wagon, told me to get out. I thought maybe he needed to fix something, but then he just drove away. Left me standing there. I called after him, ran for a bit, but he never looked back." Preston felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce. "He'll answer for this," he said quietly. "Men like that always do." "It doesn't matter now," Willow said, and there was a weariness in her voice that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I just need to figure out what to do next. The baby will come soon, maybe a month, maybe less. I don't have any money, any family. I don't even know where I am." "You're about 15 miles north of Eureka Springs," Preston said. "It's a decent town, growing fast because of the springs there. People think the water has healing properties. There are good folks there, and it's beautiful country, all hills and valleys and clear streams." "Is that where you're from?" "No, my place is about 30 miles west of there. Small ranch, nothing fancy, but it's mine. Built it myself after my parents passed. They fell into silence, the night sounds of the Arkansas wilderness rising around them. Crickets chirped, an owl hooted somewhere in the darkness, and the fire crackled steadily. Preston added more wood, determined to keep it burning strong through the night. "You should rest," he told Willow. "I'll keep watch." "You need sleep too," she protested. "I'll sleep when the sun comes up." "Right now, You and that baby need rest more than I do." Willow laid back on the bedroll, and Preston draped his coat over her as an extra blanket. She was asleep within minutes, her breathing deep and even. Preston settled himself by the fire, his rifle across his lap, and watched the stars wheel slowly overhead. He'd lived alone for 5 years now, content with his solitude, his cattle, his work. He'd courted a girl once, back when he was 21, but she'd married a banker from Fort Smith instead, choosing security over whatever future Preston could offer. He told himself he didn't mind, that he preferred the freedom of his bachelor life. But now, watching this woman sleep beside his fire, he felt something stirring in his chest that he'd thought long buried. The night passed slowly. Preston dozed occasionally, but never for long, jerking awake at every unusual sound. Once, he heard something large moving through the brush and stood with his rifle ready, but whatever it was moved on without approaching their camp. Dawn came gradually, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale pink. Willow woke as the sun cleared the horizon, sitting up stiffly. "You stayed," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. "I said I would," Preston replied simply. He made more coffee and the last of the cornmeal, this time mixing in some of the dried beef for substance. They ate in comfortable silence, and Preston found himself studying Willow in the morning light. She was beautiful, he realized, even exhausted and disheveled. Her face had a delicate structure, high cheekbones and a determined chin. Her hands, though roughened by work, moved with grace. "We need to get you to Eureka Springs," Preston said finally. "You need a proper doctor to look at you and the baby." "I can't pay a doctor," Willow said quietly. "I can." She looked at him sharply. "Why would you do that? You don't know me." Preston considered his answer carefully. "Maybe because someone should. Maybe because it's the right thing to do. Does it matter?" "It matters to me," Willow said. "I don't want to be anyone's charity case." "It's not charity," Preston said, surprised by the intensity in his own voice. "It's just helping someone who needs it. Same as I'd help a neighbor with a barn raising or a friend with a sick calf." Willow studied him for a long moment, and Preston felt something pass between them, an understanding perhaps, or the beginning of trust. "All right," she said finally, "but I'll pay you back somehow when I can." "We'll worry about that later," Preston said, standing and beginning to pack up their camp. "Right now, let's just focus on getting you to town." He debated whether to put her on his horse or try to fashion some kind of travois to pull behind. In the end, he decided riding would be faster and probably more comfortable for her. He mounted first, then helped her up behind him. She was clearly uncomfortable with the intimacy of the arrangement, but she wrapped her arms around his waist and held on. The ride to Eureka Springs took most of the morning. Preston kept the pace steady but not too fast, aware of Willow's condition and the rough terrain. She didn't complain once, though he could feel her tensing occasionally when they hit a particularly rough patch of road. They talked as they rode, and Preston found himself telling her things he rarely shared with anyone. About his parents, German immigrants who'd saved for years to buy their land. About his mother's garden, which had been her pride and joy, and his father's skill with horses. About how he'd been away buying supplies when the cholera came, and how he'd returned to find them both dead and buried by neighbors. Willow shared more of her story, too. She'd been orphaned young, raised by an aunt who'd worked her hard and shown little affection. She'd learned sewing because it was a respectable trade for a woman, and she'd been good at it, good enough to support herself. She'd thought Richard was her escape from loneliness, but instead, he'd brought her to this desperate place. "I should have seen the signs," she said. "My friend Mary warned me he had a reputation, but I didn't listen. I wanted so badly to have someone to not be alone anymore." "Being alone is better than being with the wrong person," Preston said. Yes, Willow agreed softly. I know that now. Eureka Springs appeared before them like something from a dream, nestled in a valley surrounded by densely wooded hills. The town was newer than many in Arkansas, having grown rapidly around the natural springs that gave it its name. Buildings climbed the hillsides in terraces, connected by steep streets and winding paths. The architecture was Victorian, some of the houses quite grand, testament to the wealthy visitors who came seeking the healing waters. Preston rode straight to the doctor's office, a neat white building on a relatively level street near the center of town. He helped Willow down from the horse, and she swayed slightly, gripping his arm for support. Dr. Samuel Hayes was a man in his 50s with kind eyes and gentle hands. He examined Willow while Preston waited outside, pacing the wooden sidewalk and drawing curious looks from passers-by. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor emerged. She's severely dehydrated and malnourished, Dr. Hayes said bluntly, but the baby seems strong. She's lucky you found her when you did. Another day in that heat and we'd be having a different conversation. What does she need? Preston asked. Rest, food, and water. Lots of water. She needs to stay in bed for at least a week, maybe 2. I'd like to monitor her closely until the baby comes. I'll pay for whatever she needs, Preston said. Is there a boarding house that would take her? Dr. Hayes stroked his beard thoughtfully. Mrs. Alina Murphy runs a respectable place 2 streets over. She's a widow, takes in boarders, mostly ladies passing through town. I'll send word that you're coming. Preston paid the doctor and helped Willow back onto the horse. Mrs. Murphy's boarding house was a 2-story structure painted cheerful yellow with white trim. The widow herself was a plump woman with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She looked Willow over, then turned her assessing gaze on Preston. I won't have any trouble in my house, she said firmly. There won't be any trouble, Preston assured her. Miss Crawford needs a safe place to stay until her baby comes. I'll pay a month in advance. Mrs. Murphy's expression softened slightly. Well, come in then. The poor dear looks ready to collapse. The room Mrs. Murphy showed them was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a window that looked out over the street. Willow sank onto the bed with a sigh of relief. I'll bring up some soup, Mrs. Murphy said, and fresh water. You rest now, dear. When they were alone, Willow looked up at Preston with tears in her eyes. I don't know how to thank you. You've saved my life and my baby's life. I won't forget this kindness. Preston felt uncomfortable with her gratitude. You don't need to thank me, just focus on getting better. What will you do now? Willow asked. Will you go back to your ranch? Preston hadn't really thought about it. His ranch was waiting. His cattle needed tending, and he'd already been gone longer than planned. But the thought of leaving Willow here, among strangers in a strange town, sat wrong with him. I'll stay in town for a few days, he heard himself say. Make sure you're settled, that you have everything you need. Relief flooded Willow's face, and Preston realized she'd been afraid he would leave immediately. Thank you, she whispered. Preston rented a room at the hotel down the street, a more modest establishment than some of the grand Victorian buildings that catered to wealthy health seekers. He spent the afternoon buying supplies for Willow, things a pregnant woman might need that he barely understood, but that the shopkeeper's wife assured him were essential. Fabric for baby clothes, yarn for blankets, proper food to build her strength. He visited her that evening, bringing the packages and finding her looking much improved after a day of rest and Mrs. Murphy's feeding. They sat in the parlor, chaperoned by Mrs. Murphy's presence in the adjacent room, and talked for hours. Preston found himself fascinated by Willow's intelligence and wit, which emerged now that she wasn't fighting for survival. She had opinions on everything from politics to literature, and she made him laugh with her dry observations about the other boarders. The days turned into a week, and Preston found reasons to delay his departure. His ranch could manage a little longer without him. He'd hired a reliable hand before leaving, a young man named Tom who knew cattle and could be trusted. And honestly, Preston wasn't ready to leave Willow yet. They fell into a routine. Preston would visit in the mornings, sometimes bringing fresh fruit from the market or a newspaper for Willow to read. They'd walk slowly around the neighborhood, always with Mrs. Murphy or her maid as chaperone, giving Willow the exercise Dr. Hayes recommended. In the afternoons, they'd sit in the parlor and talk, sharing stories from their lives, dreams they'd once had, hopes for the future. Preston found himself falling in love, though he tried to resist it. Willow was vulnerable, dependent on his help. It wouldn't be right to press his feelings on her. But he couldn't help the way his heart lifted when he saw her, the way her smile made the whole day seem brighter. Willow felt it too, though she was afraid to acknowledge it even to herself. She'd been so wrong about Richard, had misjudged him so completely. How could she trust her feelings now? But Preston was different from any man she'd ever known. He was steady and kind, thoughtful in ways that went beyond mere politeness. He listened when she talked, really listened, and remembered the things she told him. He treated her not as a burden but as a person worth knowing. One evening, as they sat in the parlor watching the sun set through the windows, Preston reached over and took her hand. It was the first time he'd touched her beyond helping her walk or mount a horse. Willow's breath caught, and she looked at him questioningly. "I know this might not be the right time," Preston said slowly, "and I don't want to presume anything, but I need you to know that these past weeks, getting to know you, they've meant something to me. You mean something to me." Willow's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of joy mixed with fear. "I'm pregnant with another man's child," she said. "I'm penniless. I have nothing to offer you." "You have yourself to offer," Preston said, "and that's everything I want." "Preston, I care about you too," Willow admitted. "More than I should, maybe, but I'm afraid I was so wrong about Richard. What if I'm wrong again?" "I'm not Richard," Preston said firmly. "I won't leave you. I won't abandon you or this child. I swear that to you." "How can you promise that?" Willow asked. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Preston said. "I know you're brave and strong. I know you have a good heart. I know that when you were at your lowest point, you still thought to tell me to eat, to take care of myself. I know you read poetry and love thunderstorms and make misses. Murphy laugh with your impressions of the town ladies who come to the springs. I know that I think about you constantly, that I don't want to imagine my life without you in it." Willow squeezed his hand, torn between hope and fear. "What are you asking me?" "I'm asking you to give me a chance," Preston said. "To let me court you properly. To see if what I feel, what I think you might feel too, is real and lasting. I'm not asking you to decide anything now. Just give me the chance to show you that not all men are like Richard Crawford." "All right," Willow said softly. "Yes, I'd like that." The courting was unlike anything Willow had experienced with Richard. Preston was patient and respectful, never pressing her for more than she was ready to give. They took walks through the beautiful streets of Eureka Springs, admiring the Victorian architecture and the lush vegetation fed by the natural springs. They visited the springs themselves, and Preston helped Willow dip her hands in the cool, clear water that people claimed could heal any ailment. They attended church together on Sundays, and Preston introduced her to people he'd met in town, making sure she was seen as a respectable woman and not someone to be gossiped about. When people asked about her situation, he simply said she was a widow whose husband had died on the trail, and Willow was grateful for the lie that protected her reputation. As the weeks passed, Willow's belly grew larger, and the baby became more active. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench overlooking a wooded valley, the baby kicked particularly hard. Willow gasped and put her hand to her stomach. "Are you all right?" Preston asked, immediately concerned. "Yes, the baby just kicked," Willow said, laughing. "Hard this time. May I?" Preston asked hesitantly, gesturing toward her belly. Willow guided his hand to where the baby was moving. Preston's eyes widened as he felt the small life shifting beneath his palm. "That's amazing," he breathed. "There's a whole person in there getting ready to meet the world." "Are you sure about this?" Willow asked suddenly, the question bursting from her before she could stop it. "About me, about the baby, it's not too late to walk away, I would understand." Preston took both her hands in his. "Willow, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. This baby is part of you and I love you. That means I'll love this child too as my own, if you'll let me." "I love you too," Willow said, the words escaping before she could second-guess them. "I think I have for weeks now, but I was afraid to admit it." Preston leaned forward and kissed her, gentle and sweet, and Willow felt something inside her that had been broken begin to heal. 2 weeks later, on a warm September evening, Willow went into labor. Mrs. Murphy sent for Dr. Hayes immediately and banished Preston from the house, despite his protests. He paced outside for hours, driving himself half-mad with worry. The night seemed endless, and every sound from the house made his heart race. Finally, as the sun was rising, Dr. Hayes emerged, looking tired but satisfied. "You have a healthy baby boy," he announced, "and Miss Crawford came through beautifully. She's tired but well." Preston felt his knees go weak with relief. "Can I see her?" Give Mrs. Murphy a few minutes to get things settled, then yes. When Preston was finally allowed upstairs, he found Willow propped up in bed, looking exhausted but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a soft blanket. The baby had a shock of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face. "Meet your son," Willow said softly, "if you still meant what you said." Preston approached the bed slowly, almost reverently. He looked down at the infant, so small and perfect and new. "What's his name?" "I was thinking James," Willow said, "after my father, James Crawford." "But Preston, if you and I are going to have a future together, if we're going to be a family, I don't want him to carry Richard's name. I want him to have a father who will actually love him and raise him." Preston felt tears prick his eyes, which surprised him because he couldn't remember the last time he'd cried. "Are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" "I'm saying that if you still want to marry me, I want to marry you too. And I want this baby to be yours in every way that matters." Preston leaned down and kissed her forehead. "Then yes, yes to all of it. Yes to you, yes to marriage, yes to being this boy's father, yes to building a life together. There's something else," Willow said. "Something I need to tell you before you decide for certain." Preston's heart clenched. "What is it?" "I was married to Richard, legally married. We'll need to get a divorce before we can marry. It might take time and it won't be easy. People might talk." "Let them talk," Preston said. "We'll go to Fort Smith, file the papers. You were abandoned, that's grounds enough. We'll do everything properly and legally. And in the meantime, we'll go back to my ranch. You and James. We'll build our life there while we wait for the law to catch up with our hearts." They were married 3 months later in a simple ceremony in Eureka Springs. After the divorce papers were filed and processed faster than expected, when Dr. Hayes and several other townspeople testified to Willow's abandonment. She wore a dress of pale blue that she'd sewn herself, and Preston wore his best suit, purchased new for the occasion. Mrs. Murphy cried happy tears and hosted a small reception in her parlor. Little James, now 3 months old and thriving, slept through the entire ceremony. The ride to Preston's ranch took 2 days, traveling slowly with the baby. Willow rode beside Preston in a small wagon he'd purchased specifically for his new family. As they traveled west from Eureka Springs, the land opened up into rolling hills dotted with cattle and stands of oak and pine. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was more than Willow had dared to hope. The house was small but solidly built, with a stone chimney and glass windows. Preston had added a room before returning for her, expanding the single-room cabin into a proper home with a bedroom, a kitchen area, and a front room for living. Tom, the hired hand, was a lanky young man of about 20 with a friendly face and an easy manner. He greeted them warmly and seemed genuinely pleased that Preston had brought home a family. He'd kept the ranch running smoothly in Preston's absence, and the cattle were healthy and the property well maintained. "I built a crib," Tom said shyly, showing them a beautifully crafted wooden cradle. "Thought the baby might need one. My pa taught me woodworking before he passed." Willow was touched by the gesture, and she could see Preston was too. "It's beautiful, Tom, thank you." They settled into married life with surprising ease. Preston worked the ranch during the day and Willow kept the house and cared for James. But it was more than just division of labor. They were partners, talking over decisions together, supporting each other through challenges. Preston taught Willow to ride properly, and she taught him to cook more than just basic trail food. They read together in the evenings, taking turns with books they borrowed from neighbors or bought on trips to town. James thrived, growing from a tiny infant into a chubby, happy baby. Preston was a natural father, patient and attentive. He'd walk the floor with James when the baby was fussy, sing him lullabies in his deep voice, and spend hours just watching him sleep. Willow fell more in love with her husband every time she saw him with their son. Because James was their son, in every way that mattered. Richard had provided nothing but genetic material and abandonment. Preston was the one who stayed up through fevers, who celebrated first smiles and first words, who built toys and told stories and offered comfort. Their first year together wasn't without challenges. Money was tight, especially with medical bills from James's birth and the costs of setting up a proper household. There was a drought that summer that threatened their cattle, and they had to dig deeper wells and haul water from distant streams. Preston broke his arm in a fall from a horse, and Willow had to manage much of the ranch work herself for 6 weeks, learning to rope and brand alongside Tom. But through it all, they had each other. On the hardest days, when Willow felt overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood and ranch life, Preston would hold her and remind her how far they'd come. On the nights when Preston lay awake worrying about money or cattle or the 100 things that could go wrong on a ranch, Willow would talk him through his fears and help him find solutions. They made love for the first time on a cool autumn night, 3 months after James's birth, when Dr. Hayes had given Willow the all-clear. Preston was tender and careful, constantly asking if she was all right, if she wanted to stop. Willow found herself crying afterward, but they were tears of joy and release, of finally feeling whole and safe and loved. "What's wrong?" Preston asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing's wrong," Willow assured him. "Everything's right. For the first time in so long, everything is finally right." Their second year brought new prosperity. The drought broke, and their cattle multiplied. Preston bought more land from a neighbor who was moving east, expanding the ranch. Tom asked if he could stay on permanently, and they agreed, building him a small cabin at the edge of the property. He became like family, eating meals with them several times a week and serving as a doting uncle to James. Willow discovered she was pregnant again in the spring of their second year together. This time, the pregnancy was entirely different. She was healthy and well-fed, supported and loved. Preston doted on her, building her a rocking chair and bringing her wildflowers from the meadows. James was walking now, a toddling, curious boy who looked so much like Willow, it made Preston's heart ache with love. Their daughter was born on a crisp October evening, arriving quickly and with far less fuss than James. They named her Sarah, after Preston's mother, and she had her father's dark eyes and stubborn chin. Preston cried when he held her for the first time, this child who was his by blood as well as by choice. "We made her," he said in wonder. "You and me together. We made this whole life together," Willow reminded him. "Everything we have, we built from nothing but hope and hard work." The years flowed past, marked by the seasons and the rhythms of ranch life. James grew tall and strong, learning to ride and rope alongside his father. Sarah proved to be fearless and clever, keeping her parents on their toes. 2 more children followed, another boy they named Daniel and a daughter called Grace. Preston expanded the ranch steadily, gaining a reputation for honest dealing and quality cattle. Willow started a small business making quilts and selling them in Eureka Springs, using her sewing skills to add to the family income. They built a larger house, keeping the original cabin as a bunkhouse for seasonal hands. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Preston took Willow back to the spot where he'd found her on the dusty road. It took some searching to locate it, and the place looked different now, less desolate somehow. But Willow recognized the cluster of scrub oaks where Preston had made his fire. "I think about that night sometimes," Preston said. "About how easily I might have missed you, might have taken a different road or traveled at a different time." "I think about it too," Willow admitted. "About how close I came to giving up, to just lying there and letting the sun take me. But something kept me holding on, some stubborn refusal to quit. And then you appeared, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even known I was praying." "I was so scared," Preston confessed. "I'd never felt responsible for another person's life before. I didn't know if I could save you, but I knew I had to try." "You did more than save my life," Willow said. "You gave me a reason to live it. You showed me what real love looks like, what a real partnership should be. You chose me and James when you had no obligation to either of us." Preston pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair. "I chose you because I could not choose you. From the moment I saw you lying there, something in my heart recognized something in yours. We were meant to find each other on that road." They stood together for a long time, watching the sun set over the Arkansas hills, remembering who they'd been and celebrating who they'd become. James grew up knowing the truth about his birth father, told in age-appropriate ways as he matured. Preston and Willow believed in honesty, but they also made sure James understood that biology didn't define family. Preston was his father in every meaningful way, and James never doubted it. He grew into a fine young man, responsible and kind, who took over more and more of the ranch work as Preston's hair grayed and his back grew stiffer. Sarah married a neighboring rancher's son when she was 21, a good man who reminded Willow of Preston in his steadiness and integrity. Daniel became a doctor, inspired by Dr. Hayes, and set up practice in Eureka Springs. Grace, the youngest, inherited Willow's talent for sewing and opened a dress shop in town that became quite successful. Preston and Willow grew old together on the ranch they'd built. Their hair turned gray and their bodies slowed, but their love never dimmed. They still sat together on the porch in the evenings, holding hands and watching the sunset. They still made each other laugh with private jokes and shared memories. They still looked at each other sometimes with wonder, grateful for the chance encounter on a dusty road that had changed everything. On a warm June evening, when Preston was 72 and Willow was 70, they sat on that same porch surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. Someone had asked how they'd met, and the story was told once again, embellished and enhanced by decades of retelling. "Grandpa found Grandma on the side of the road," James explained to his grandson, a bright-eyed boy of 8. "She was in trouble, and he stopped to help instead of riding on by." "Why did you stop?" the boy asked Preston. "Weren't you scared?" Preston considered the question carefully. "I was scared," he admitted. "But I was more scared of what would happen if I didn't stop. Your grandma needed help, and I was the only one there to give it." Sometimes in life, you reach a moment where you have to choose between what's easy and what's right. That day, stopping was right. "And then they fell in love," Sarah added, smiling at her parents. "Just like in a fairy tale." "Not exactly like a fairy tale," Willow corrected gently. "Fairy tales make love seem easy, like it just happens and then everything is perfect forever. Real love is work. It's choosing each other every day, even on the hard days. It's building something together, brick by brick, moment by moment. Your grandfather and I have had our struggles, our arguments, our difficult times, but we've faced them together, and that's what matters." "I wouldn't change a single moment," Preston said, squeezing Willow's hand. "Even the hard ones, because they led us here to this life, this family. That night I built a fire on the side of the road and stayed with your grandmother. I had no idea what I was starting. I just knew I couldn't leave her alone. But that simple act of staying, of being present when someone needed help, it became the foundation of everything we built." The evening deepened, and eventually the family dispersed, heading to their various homes. Preston and Willow were left alone under the stars, the same stars that had wheeled overhead on that first night 47 years ago. "You think about him sometimes?" Preston asked quietly. "Richard, I mean. Wonder what became of him?" "Rarely," Willow said honestly. "I heard he died years ago, drunk and alone in some mining camp. I should probably feel something about that, but mostly I just feel grateful. Grateful that his cruelty led me to you, that his worst moment became the beginning of my best life. That baby he abandoned is a better man than he ever was," Preston said. "James has his mother's character, not his father's cowardice. James has 2 parents who loved him and showed him how to be a good man," Willow said. "That's all any child really needs." They sat in companionable silence for a while, then Preston spoke again. "I want you to know that you've given me the best life I could have imagined. When my parents died, I thought I'd always be alone. I'd accepted it, built my life around that assumption. But then I found you, and suddenly I wasn't alone anymore. I had a partner, a family, a reason to build something that would last beyond my own lifetime." "We found each other," Willow corrected. "And we saved each other. You saved me from dying on that road, yes, but I saved you from loneliness, from a half-lived life. We were both lost in our own ways, and we found each other exactly when we needed to." Preston stood and offered his hand to Willow, pulling her gently to her feet. They walked together into the house they'd shared for nearly half a century, past the photographs on the walls showing their life together in frozen moments. A wedding photo, young and hopeful. James as a baby, Preston holding him with such tender pride. The 4 children lined up in front of the house. Grandchildren at Christmas. A lifetime captured in silver and paper. In their bedroom, Preston helped Willow with the buttons on her dress, his fingers still knowing the routine after all these years. They prepared for bed with the comfortable intimacy of decades of practice. When they finally lay down together, Preston pulled Willow close, her head resting on his shoulder as it had for thousands of nights. "Thank you," Willow whispered, "for stopping that day, for building a fire, for staying." "Thank you for letting me," Preston replied. "For trusting me when you had every reason not to trust anyone, for building this life with me." They drifted off to sleep together, secure in the love they'd built from nothing, from a moment of kindness on a dusty road that had bloomed into a lifetime of devotion. Years later, when they were both gone and their children were settling their affairs, someone found an old journal that Preston had kept. In it, he'd written about that first night, the night he'd found Willow on the road. The entry was simple but profound, written in Preston's careful hand. Found a woman today, pregnant and abandoned on the road to Eureka Springs. Built her a fire and stayed with her through the night. Don't know what tomorrow will bring, but I know I can't leave her to face it alone. Something tells me this is important, that this moment matters in ways I can't yet understand. Lord, if you're listening, help me do right by this woman and her child. They deserve better than what they've been given. Below that entry in Willow's flowing script was an addition written many years later. He did right by us. More than right. He gave us everything. He gave us love. Their graves rest side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, beneath an oak tree that Preston planted on their first anniversary. The inscription on their shared headstone reads simply, Preston Shaw and Willow Shaw, beloved parents and grandparents. They found each other on a dusty road and built a love that lasted forever. The ranch still operates today, now in its 5th generation of family ownership. James's great-great-grandchildren work the land, raise cattle, and tell the story of how their family began with an act of kindness, a fire built against the darkness, and a cowboy who chose to stay when he could have ridden away. On summer evenings, when the work is done and the family gathers on the porch, they sometimes look toward that hill where Preston and Willow rest. The love story that began with abandonment and desperation, that was forged in fire and faith, that grew strong through years of partnership and devotion, remains the foundation of everything the family is and does. Because that's the real power of love, not the fairy tale kind that exists in perfect moments, but the real, lived, daily kind that chooses to stay, to build, to endure. The kind that says, you are not alone and you never will be again. The kind that builds a fire against the darkness and tends it faithfully through all the nights to come. Preston Shaw stopped on a dusty road one summer day in 1877 and changed the course of 2 lives, and then 4, and then dozens, and eventually hundreds. He stayed when staying was hard. He loved when love required sacrifice. He built when building seemed impossible. And in doing so, he created something that would outlast them both, a legacy of love and family that continues to this day. That is the story of Preston and Willow Shaw, of a fire built on a dusty road, of promises kept and love that endured. It is a story of second chances, of redemption, of the transformative power of simple kindness. It is a story that began with desperation and ended with joy, that started with loss and concluded with abundance. It is, quite simply, a story of love in all its messy, beautiful, complicated, perfect reality. And it is a story that, once told, is never forgotten, passed down through generations as a reminder that sometimes, when everything seems lost, salvation appears in the form of a stranger who chooses to stop, to build a fire and to stay.